I spent months restoring my late father's antique clock. One morning, I found it shattered, the trim split, and gears knocked loose. My neighbor's son smirked and said, "It's just a clock. Look junky anyway." I walked away without a word. The next day, he came outside to find something missing that. The day the clock arrived was quiet. I remember that part clearly, like the rest of the world had paused for a breath. The movers called it one of those old ones, like they were dropping off a refrigerator. It was wrapped in layers of plastic and cardboard, leaning at an awkward tilt on their dolly. I watched from the front steps of my house, not saying much, just trying to take it all in. My name's Marcus. I'm 38 years old, born and raised right here in Maysville, Georgia. I've been a locksmith since I was 20, running my own little shop off Main Street. My dad, Arthur, he was a clockmaker, not the kind who had a shop or anything fancy. He just worked in the garage, quiet, meticulous, more focused on the guts of time than the way it ticked around him. He passed last fall. Stroke. Sudden. We weren't close in the way that fathers and sons are supposed to be. I mean, we didn't talk about feelings or hug or any of that, but we shared silence and tools. That was our bond. The grandfather clock had been his favorite, a towering mahogany thing, 6 feet tall with brass accents, hand-carved trim, and a chime that used to make the whole house breathe. It had been sitting in the corner of his workshop for years after it broke down. One day, he used to mutter, running a thumb along the dusty faceplate, "I'll get to it." He never did. So when it came to me in the will, I didn't cry, didn't say thank you, just nodded and signed where they told me to. I moved it into the corner of my front room, right by the window. The wood was warped in places, the glass pane cracked at the bottom. The pendulum hung limp and lifeless like it had given up waiting. The dust was thick enough to write your name in. It was a wreck, but it was mine, and it was his. After work each day, I started cleaning it. First just a soft rag and a little oil, then deeper, opening up the case, taking notes, sketching out what needed fixing. I ordered parts online and drove 2 hours to pick up vintage gears from a guy in Macon. I called in a favor with an old client who used to restore furniture. On weekends, I sat with a Dremel in hand, carving new trim to match what had splintered off. It wasn't just a project. It was how I grieved. I played his records while I worked. The old blues ones with the scratchy guitars and gravel voice singers. Sometimes I talked to him, just soft stuff like, "You'd have called this a mess." Or, "I figured out the gear ratio today, Dad." It helped, more than anything else had. 6 months went by like that. And one Sunday evening, I wound it up. The first tick was so faint I thought I imagined it. But then it came again. And then the pendulum swung, slow and steady. When the chimes hit, soft, warm, not perfect but damn close. I stood there like a statue, just listening. I dragged it over by the window, where I could see it from my porch swing. Every evening after that, I sat out there with a beer, watching it, listening. It didn't just keep time. It held him. And now, in its quiet, steady rhythm, I finally heard my father speak. It was a Tuesday morning, late spring, already hot enough to sweat through a shirt by 9. I was sipping my coffee on the porch, like I always did, just watching the street wake up. The chimes from the clock drifted through the open window clean, even, just like I'd tuned them. That's when I heard the crash. It wasn't subtle. Glass shattering, metal hitting wood. A sound so sharp it made me jump out of my seat. I was on my feet and inside in 2 seconds flat. The clock was ruined. Front panel smashed, the pendulum lying sideways on the floor, its brass casing dented. The carved trim I'd spent weeks shaping was split down the middle. The gears inside had spilled out like guts. It looked like it had been hit with a truck. I stood there frozen. My hand still gripped the coffee mug. I didn't realize it had cracked in my palm until the handle dropped to the floor. Then I saw him. Blake, 17, my neighbor's boy. Tall, lanky, with a mop of blonde curls and that smug, half-baked grin he always wore when he knew he'd gotten away with something. He was standing at the edge of my yard, tossing a rock up and down in his hand. He saw me, made no move to hide, just shrugged. "It's just a stupid clock," he said, like he was commenting on the weather. Looked like trash anyway. That did something to me. Not rage, not yet. Just this numbness, like someone poured cold water down my spine. I knelt slowly, picking up the broken pendulum with trembling fingers. Brass dust stuck to my palms. The gears were bent, scratched, beyond repair. I didn't say a word, not to him, not to anyone. I spent the rest of that morning gathering the pieces, laid them out on the dining room table like a wake. The smell of dust and oil filled the air. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. This wasn't just a clock. It was my father, my grief, my 6 months of quiet healing. And Blake had turned it into a punchline. But I wasn't going to yell. I wasn't going to slam doors or march across the street. I'm not built like that. What I am is a locksmith, a man who understands mechanisms, patience, precision. I would respond, just not the way he expected. The next morning, Blake's scream shook me out of bed before sunrise. "Are you freaking kidding me?" I didn't rush to the window. I already knew what he'd find. I had planned every detail down to the minute. I brewed a pot of coffee instead, taking my time, and stepped out onto the porch with my mug as if nothing was out of the ordinary. Blake was pacing his driveway, red-faced, fist clenching and unclenching. His prized BMX bike, the one with the matte black frame and neon green rims, sat propped on a pair of cinder blocks, completely rimless. Just a naked, helpless frame. He spun around and pointed at the empty wheel wells like the universe owed him an explanation. "What the hell, man?" I took a sip of coffee. Warm, smooth, no sugar. Without looking at him, I said, calm as the breeze. It's just a bike. Looked cheap anyway. The words hung in the air like smoke. His jaw worked, but no sound came out. He just stared at me, eyes wide, chest heaving like a kicked-up dog. For a second, I thought he might march across the street and start swinging, but he didn't. He turned and stormed back into the house, muttering under his breath. The screen door slammed behind him. A few seconds later, I heard the muffled argument start. Voices, his parents trading blame. That was part of the plan, too. I knew the cameras didn't work. Blake had bragged about it at a neighborhood barbecue last fall, laughing about how they were just for show. Said it like he was proud of it. Dumb mistake. And the rims? Let's just say they weren't far. Just stashed in the woods behind the old church lot where nobody ever looked. I didn't need them. Just wanted them gone. I watched the sun rise over the street as the shouting next door escalated. His mother's voice shrill. His dad trying to keep the peace. Blake slammed another door. The difference between revenge and repair is detail, precision. I'd spent my life working with mechanisms, gears, locks, quiet systems designed to move without anyone noticing. Blake broke something sacred. I wasn't going to break him back. I was going to dismantle him, one careless part at a time. 3 Saturdays in a row, Blake snuck out just after 9 p.m., same backpack slung over his shoulder, same smug strut across his front yard like he was starring in his own little movie. I waited until his tail lights disappeared before I followed, a few minutes behind, keeping my lights off until I hit the highway. He wasn't clever, just cocky. That's how I found the lake. A little out past Cedar Ridge, tucked behind a busted fence and a no trespassing sign that had faded to nothing. It wasn't some innocent night swim or quiet fishing trip. No, Blake and his buddies had turned it into their private playground. Beer cans, loud music, smoke in the air. Some nights they climbed on the closed-off docks, other nights they lit bonfires in the sand like it wasn't wildfire season. And Blake, he was the ringleader. At first, I just watched, parked off the trail, camera in hand, long lens already dusted off from a forgotten drawer. Then I started filming. Quick clips at first, Blake laughing with a beer in one hand, dangling his feet off the back of his dad's stolen truck, the license plate clear in every shot. Over 3 weekends, I gathered over 24 videos and photos. Blake breaking open locked gates, Blake tossing beer bottles at tree trunks, Blake stumbling around the fire pit, shirtless and shouting. Every time I looked through the viewfinder, all I could see was my father's broken clock. On a Thursday morning, I transferred the files to a USB drive. Simple label on the front, weekend proof. I slipped it into a manila envelope and wrote the address in neat, block letters. Blake's father was a military man, clean-cut, quiet, the kind who raked his leaves in straight lines. Ultra strict. I'd seen the man reduce a cable guy to tears over a missed appointment. He answered the door in his uniform. Didn't say a word when I handed him the envelope. Just nodded once and shut the door with surgical precision. The fallout started that evening. Shouting. Not the usual arguments. This was louder, wilder. Blake's mother crying. Blake yelling something about privacy. A door slammed so hard the glass pane cracked. The next day, Blake didn't leave the house. That weekend, the truck was gone. And by Monday morning, a sign showed up on their lawn. Youth Accountability Retreat, church-sponsored program. Mandatory attendance. I didn't have to ask where Blake was going. I'd heard about the place, outside of town, run by a Baptist group with discipline in its bones. No phones, no late nights, no bonfires or beers. Just sermons, silence, and manual labor. That Sunday evening, I stood on my porch and listened to the ticking of my clock through the open window. Clean, steady. Blake had tried to tear something apart. I was just getting started putting him back together, one consequence at a time. It was the smell that woke me. Not smoke, not at first, just something sour, chemical. Then came the crackle, the soft, terrible sound of something burning alive. I ran to the back window and saw the glow orange, rising fast, too fast, and by the time I stumbled outside in my boxers and boots, my tool shed was already half engulfed. I didn't bother with the hose. I knew it was gone. The fire department showed up 10 minutes later. They walked the perimeter, took notes, nodded like they'd seen this 100 times. Faulty wiring, the guy said, barely glancing at the charred husk. Happens all the time, except it didn't. I knew every wire in that shed. I'd redone them myself last fall. Tight, clean, perfect. The place hadn't seen a spark in years. This was personal, but I didn't file a report. Didn't demand fingerprints or footprints or a badge number scribbled on a notepad. I just nodded and thanked them, let them drive away. Then I made a call. My cousin Leo runs a salvage lot about an hour south, old TVs, rusted ovens, furniture with one leg. He also has a side hustle in scrap antiques. I asked him for something specific, a grandfather clock case, burnt, but not completely destroyed. Something that could pass for tragedy. He didn't ask why, just told me to bring a truck. 3 days later, it arrived, perfect in its imperfection. Scorched sides, the wood warped, but still recognizable. I spent the next 2 nights repainting it with ash gray and deep walnut tones to match mine. I glued on a few spare gears from a box in the attic, added brass trimmings that looked just familiar enough. Then I staged the scene. I placed the ruined case in the driveway just after dusk, taped a photo to the front, one I'd taken weeks ago, saved just in case. Blake, passed out drunk, curled up next to a half-dead campfire, beer can inches from his fingers. His face soft, stupid, helpless. I printed it in glossy color, right from my desktop. Then I carried the whole setup, clock, and photo across the street and laid it gently on their front porch. No note, no threats, just a message loud enough to echo through their walls. By morning, it was gone. Nothing was said. But that week, something changed. Blake didn't come outside, not once. His bedroom light stayed off most nights. His mother's usual shrieks turned to hushed whispers. His father started parking the truck behind the fence, like they were expecting something worse. From my porch, I sat and watched, listened to the steady chime of my clock, ticking like a heartbeat, echoing what Blake now heard every time he closed his eyes. This wasn't revenge. This was a reminder. I knew what he did, and he would never know what came next. The trick to getting into a Wi-Fi network is knowing who set it up. In this case, that was Blake himself. I remembered the day he bragged about naming the router Big Baller Blake at a neighborhood cookout, right after he boasted that he used his birthday as the password so even my mom can remember it. So I tried it, Big Baller Blake _17. Bingo. From there, it wasn't hard. A basic keylogger script uploaded to his family's shared laptop, the one I'd seen him carry into the garage more than once when their house got too loud. Took about 5 minutes in a flash drive. Then I waited. It took less than a week. On a Tuesday night around 11:43 p.m., Blake logged into some sketchy-looking message board using the username @SmokeRiders. He was chatting with a girl named Kayla from the lake crowd, based on their messages, and clearly trying too hard to impress. Then he typed the line that would end everything. Lit his shed up. He deserved it. Should have stayed out of my business. I paused. Read it again. Then copied the entire thread and saved it as a PDF. I made 2 more backups, one on a thumb drive, another on my encrypted drive in the shop. Sunday afternoon, I waited until their car was gone, just the father home. I walked across the street, dressed neat, shirt tucked in, envelope in hand. I didn't knock. I just rang the bell and waited. Blake's father opened the door, still in his undershirt. Looked like he'd been doing yard work. He gave me a tight nod, like a man who didn't want conversation. I handed him the envelope. For you, I said. What's this? Proof. I turned and walked away before he could ask more. I didn't hear the yelling right away. It came maybe 10 minutes later, full volume, every wall in the house vibrating. Then something slammed hard, maybe a chair, maybe Blake's pride. I heard glass break. His father's voice rose, rough with disbelief. You did what? By dusk, Blake was gone. I saw him get into the back seat of a car with out-of-county plates. His mother stood on the porch, arms crossed, eyes puffy. His father didn't even come out to say goodbye. Blake didn't look back. No suitcase. Just a backpack, like he was going to school, not exile. I found out later through neighborhood whispers, he'd been sent to live with an uncle across town. Nobody said why, but I knew. And now Blake knew what it meant to be exposed, not just punished, but seen. Blake reappeared about a month later, thinner, quieter, and freshly humiliated. He moved like someone walking on eggshells, keeping his head down and his mouth shut. His parents didn't say much either. No yelling, no lectures floating through the walls, just silence, like a ceasefire after a long war. Then one morning I saw him walking down Maple Street in a cheap polo and khakis, heading toward the pawn shop on the corner. It used to be a video rental place, but now it was all electronics and busted tools. I watched him through the glass for a week, behind the counter, ringing up dusty speakers, sorting through boxes of mismatched cords, trying to build a life. It almost made me feel something like sympathy. Almost. Instead, I waited. On a Thursday, around 2:45 p.m., Blake stepped out back for a smoke, left his ratty black backpack leaning against a busted stereo behind the counter. That was the window. I'd already lined up a petty thief named Rondo, used to boost laptops from community college kids. All he needed was the bag. I paid him $50. Inside that backpack was a notebook, one of those spiral kinds with the metal ring stretched from being shoved in and out of pockets. Inside, names, prices, serial numbers. None of it matched the inventory tags at the store. Some of the stuff was straight up stolen. Headphones from a busted shipment, a tablet from a friend, a camera with the lens removed and no box. It was Blake's side hustle, unofficial, of course. That weekend, I printed copies of the notebook pages and slid them into another plain envelope. No label this time. I dropped it off after dark, slid it under the pawn shop's locked front door. On Monday morning, Blake was gone. I watched from my porch as the shop owner, a squat man with gray hair and a permanent scowl, walked him out. No argument, no warning, just a hard finger pointed toward the sidewalk and a slam of the door that said everything. By Tuesday, Blake was back on the street. No job, no bike, no allies. Word spread fast in a town like ours. Nobody wanted to hire a kid with theft rumors swirling around him. No ID, no resume, nothing but a reputation he couldn't scrub clean. He started couch surfing. One night with a friend, 2 nights in a tent behind the old movie theater. Eventually, he started posting on forums, begging for work. Anything helps, he wrote. I watched it all unfold, quietly, from my porch. Some kids learn by getting grounded. Blake was learning what it meant to fall, not all at once, but piece by piece, like the gears of a clock-stripped bear. Some men break when they lose a job, others when they lose their pride. But Blake's father? I knew what would break him. The piano. It sat in their front room, angled just right to catch the sunlight through the bay window. A 1920s Baldwin baby grand, cherry finish, hand-tuned every spring. Blake's grandmother had passed it down, a relic from a more dignified time. His mother played hymns on Sundays. His dad dusted it twice a week like it was sacred. That piano was more than furniture. It was proof. Proof that their family had roots, that they were cultured, that they were better than the noise around them. And it was about to disappear. A month after Blake got fired from the pawn shop, I learned something useful. The church camp Blake had been forced to attend? Not free. It cost a few grand, and his parents had taken out a personal loan to cover it. Not unusual. What was unusual was the cosigner, Blake's dad. Even better? The loan was secured, backed by a lien against personal property, the piano. A week later, I created a fake invoice for piano restoration services. $1,000 for refinishing, $600 for internal tuning, another $800 for transportation and specialty humidification. All of it routed through a dummy LLC I'd registered 6 months ago for locksmith side jobs. I filed a lien with the bank, claiming Blake's parents hadn't paid. And then I waited. It took 9 days. The tow truck arrived just after 10 a.m. on a Tuesday. Big rig, 2 men in polos, gloves on, clipboard ready. I stood on my porch and watched as the driver rang the bell. Blake's mom opened the door in a robe, coffee in hand. When he pointed to the paperwork, she laughed. Then he stepped aside and nodded at the piano. Her face changed. She screamed. I couldn't hear every word, but I caught enough. Mistake. My mother's. You can't. But the paperwork was legit. The bank had already processed it. The lien was active. The men stepped inside. 10 minutes later, the piano was on a lift, strapped tight, wrapped in gray moving blankets like a corpse. Blake stood in the window, arms crossed. Not angry, not yelling, just watching. His mom followed the truck down the driveway, crying like someone had died. His dad stood still, hands behind his back, not saying a word. Neighbors peeked through blinds. One took a photo. By dinner, the story had spread. Piano repossessed. No one asked why. I sipped a beer from my porch, the clock ticking behind me in its perfect rhythm. Some lessons take months. This one? Just one truck, one lie, and one family's last shred of pride hauled away like junk. It was past midnight when the knock came. Soft at first, like someone wasn't sure they wanted to be heard. I almost didn't get up. I figured it was a mistake. Maybe a drunk neighbor or some kid playing a dare. But when I opened the door, there he was. Blake, thin, pale, hollow-eyed. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. Hair overgrown, shirt hanging loose. He wasn't the smug, smirking kid from the porch that day. He wasn't even the kid from the pawn shop. He looked like someone who didn't quite know where he belonged anymore. He didn't speak at first, just stood there, backpack slung low on one shoulder like he'd been walking with it for hours. I stepped onto the porch and shut the door behind me. He stared down at the boards between us. I get it, he said finally, voice scratchy. You win. He didn't say it with anger. No fire. Just surrender. I don't even know who I am anymore. The porch light hummed above us. I said nothing for a while. Let the weight of those words hang there between us. Then I crossed my arms and leaned back against the railing. This wasn't about winning, I said. It was about respect. He looked up. My dad wasn't a loud man, I continued. He didn't yell. He didn't need to. He built things, fixed them, taught me that if something matters, you take care of it. Blake swallowed hard, eyes glassy. That clock you smashed? I said. That wasn't just wood and brass. That was 6 months of grief. That was the only thing I had left of him that still worked. He nodded, slowly, like each word struck something deeper than the last. I don't forgive you, I said, quiet now. But I think you understand what happens when you don't care who you hurt. I do, he said. Then he turned, didn't ask for anything, didn't say goodbye. Just walked back down the steps and into the dark, one quiet footstep after another. I stayed out on the porch long after he was gone. The clock ticked behind me, steady as ever, but somehow it felt quieter. This wasn't victory. It was a reminder. Sometimes, consequences are the only thing that speaks loud enough to matter. A month passed. The porch stayed quiet. No more shouts from Blake's yard. No late-night door knocks. His parents barely came outside, like they were hoping the town would forget them if they stayed still long. And I wasn't holding my breath. Then, on a cloudy Monday morning, the news came. A friend from City Hall, guy named Rick who owed me a favor from way back, sent me a text with a photo of a newspaper clipping. Local crime roundup. Blake Simmons, 18, and Daniel Simmons, 47, were arrested late Sunday in connection to an illegal pawn operation involving stolen electronics, counterfeit resale records, and fraud. Charges included possession of stolen property, conspiracy to defraud, and obstructing an investigation. A police source confirmed the investigation began after anonymous documentation was submitted containing transaction records and identifying stolen merchandise. The evidence? That notebook I had pulled from Blake's bag. The same one he scribbled his half-baked scheme into with barely legible chicken scratch. The one I'd copied and handed off to the pawn shop owner months earlier. It had made its way to the police after the shop's audit flagged missing inventory. My envelope had been passed on, quietly. No one knew who dropped it off. I'd made sure of that. Blake had just turned 18, tried as an adult, sentenced to 8 months in county lockup, followed by probation, community service, and mandatory counseling. His uncle, the one who took him in, was arrested too. Turns out the whole pawn ring was run out of that house. I printed the article, folded it neatly, and walked inside. The clock stood as tall and proud as ever by the window. Its chimes had softened a bit with the summer humidity, but they still rang clean, steady. I opened the glass door, lifted the brass weights gently, and slid the folded newspaper clipping underneath the baseboard, right beneath the chime chain. A memory stored the way my father would have liked. Quiet, tidy, complete. That week, I got a call from the town library. They were holding a local craftsman exhibition: woodworking, metalwork, restored heirlooms. They asked if I'd consider lending something for display. For the first time in years, I said yes. On Saturday, I loaded the clock into the back of my truck, strapped it carefully against foam padding, and drove it into town. The library staff set it near the entrance, spotlighted under a tall window. I stood back as people gathered, admired the details: the scrollwork, the polished brass hands, the perfectly tuned chimes. No one knew what it had been through, or what I had. That clock had once been broken beyond saving. Now it stood whole again, not just ticking, but speaking. Not just keeping time, but holding it. My father would have liked that. And for the first time since he passed, I felt like I had finally kept something that mattered alive.